The night my son-in-law tried to have me removed from my own home, he was smiling the whole time. That smile, easy, practiced, the kind you'd trust on a car salesman or a Sunday school teacher, I'd seen it for 11 years and never once questioned it. That was my mistake, one I almost didn't survive. My name is Walter Ashford. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years building a medical supply distribution company out of a single warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. Nothing handed to me. Nothing inherited. My wife Helen and I started with a second mortgage on our house and a handshake deal with a regional hospital network. When I sold the company 4 years ago, the number on the wire transfer was $41 million. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with Helen after we got the call from her attorney, and she just laughed. Not from joy exactly, more like disbelief. Like two people who'd been walking uphill so long they'd forgotten what flat ground felt like. Helen died 14 months after I sold the business. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 9 weeks from diagnosis. 9 weeks. I used to think I understood grief from losing my parents, from losing friends. I didn't understand anything. Losing Helen was like losing the operating system of my life. Everything still looked the same on the outside. I still got up, made coffee, read the news, but nothing ran right anymore. Our daughter Renee was 37 when her mother died. She'd been married to a man named Paul Strickland for 6 years by then. Paul was in commercial real estate development. That was how he described himself at every dinner party, every holiday gathering, every conversation with a stranger. Commercial real estate development. He said it the way some men say Harvard just once. Casually, but loud enough. He was 42, well-dressed, confident in the particular way of men who've never been seriously tested. Renee adored him. I had never completely trusted him, but I loved my daughter, so I kept that to myself. The first year after Helen passed, I barely left the house. Renee called every day, sometimes twice. She'd come over on weekends and we'd sit on the back porch where Helen used to grow tomatoes, and we wouldn't even talk most of the time. Just sat there. That was enough. Those months, I thought Paul was decent. He'd shake my hand at the door, ask how I was sleeping, bring a bottle of wine. I revised my opinion of him slightly upward. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe he was just one of those men who took time to warm up. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that during those same months, Paul was leveraging his connection to me in ways I'd never authorized. He'd mentioned my name to investors, implied a relationship that didn't exist, borrowed credibility he hadn't earned to raise money for development projects that were, at their core, fraudulent. A Ponzi structure disguised as a real estate fund. New investor money paying returns to old investors while Paul collected fees and covered his own losses. The SEC would later estimate it ran for nearly 4 years. Millions of dollars. Ordinary people, retirees, small business owners, who believed in him partly because of the casual mentions of his father-in-law, the medical supply executive from Columbus. I didn't know any of this on the evening of April 14th, 13 months after Helen died. I decided to host a dinner. An anniversary dinner of sorts. Helen and I had been married 40 years before she passed, and April had always been our month. Our first date was in April. Our wedding was in April. I wanted to mark it somehow. Not a sad occasion, something to celebrate what we'd had. I invited Renee and Paul, my brother-in-law Frank and his wife Carol, my longtime attorney and friend Ben Calloway and his wife, and 2 couples who had been close friends of ours for decades. 12 people total. I'd had it catered. Helen would have done it herself, but I couldn't manage that yet. Paul arrived with Renee around 6:30. He was wearing a sport coat I hadn't seen before, dark navy, and he had that smile going full wattage from the moment he walked in. He helped himself to the bar immediately, which was normal for him, and started working the room. I remember watching him from across the living room and thinking he seemed almost too comfortable. Looser than usual. Like a man who'd already decided how the evening was going to go. Dinner was served at 7. I sat at the head of the table. Paul sat to my left, between me and his brother Craig, who had come as Paul's +1 when the original invitation to a colleague fell through. Craig Strickland was 39, a year younger than Paul, and had always struck me as the quieter of the 2 brothers. less polished, more watchful. He worked in property management, loosely affiliated with Paul's operations. I'd never had strong feelings about Craig either way. He was just Paul's brother. Background furniture. I had poured myself a bourbon before sitting down. A small one, Woodford Reserve. Something I'd been doing at dinner since Helen died. A quiet ritual. My glass was on the table to my right. Paul had poured himself the same. The table was set formally, the way Helen always preferred, with water glasses and wine glasses, and the bourbon sitting slightly back from the dinner setting. About 20 minutes into the meal, I excused myself to speak briefly with the caterer about timing for the main course. Ben had asked me something about it, and I wanted to confirm. I was gone maybe 3 minutes. When I came back and sat down, something felt slightly off, not dramatically, not a blaring alarm, just a small wrongness I couldn't immediately place. My glass had been moved maybe an inch and a half, closer to the center of the table than I'd left it. I looked at Paul. He was talking to Frank about something, gesturing with his wine glass, laughing. He didn't look at me when I sat down. That was the thing. Most people glance up when someone returns to the table. Paul was very deliberately not glancing up. I picked up my bourbon and held it. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. 34 years in business taught me to read people, but I've never been the type to assume malice before incompetence. Helen used to tease me about it. She said I had too much goodwill for the world. Maybe she was right. Maybe that's exactly why what happened next is so hard to explain without sounding calculated or cold. Because what I did next was calculated, and I'm not ashamed of it. I set my glass back down, quietly without drawing attention. Over the next few minutes, I participated in the table conversation, something about a city council vote on downtown development, a topic Paul was animated about. And while everyone was leaning slightly in that direction, I reached across and switched my glass with Craig's. Craig's glass was to his right, mine to his left. They were identical rocks glasses with the same amber pour. He wasn't looking. Nobody was looking. It took perhaps 2 seconds. I picked up the water glass instead and took a sip. My heart was going faster than I wanted it to. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I'd switch the glasses of an innocent man over nothing, over a glass being an inch off from where I'd left it. I told myself I'd find a way to switch them back before dessert, and nobody would ever know I'd had a suspicious thought in my head. 40 minutes later, Greg put his hand on the table and said he wasn't feeling right. The room shifted the way rooms do when something goes wrong at a dinner party, the conversation stopping mid-sentence, the chairs turning. Craig's face had gone pale, a kind of greenish pale, and he was perspiring. He said his chest felt strange. He said he felt dizzy. "Craig, what's wrong?" Paul said. His voice was steady, controlled. I watched Paul's face in that moment. Most people, when someone they love is suddenly ill, have a few seconds of pure, unguarded reaction. Fear, confusion, that animal alertness. Paul's face went through something different. For just a fraction of a second, before the concern settled in, there was something else. Calculation, an adjustment. The look of a man revising a plan. I excused myself to call 911. In the hallway, away from the table, I called Ben instead. "I need you to stay," I said. "Don't let anyone leave. I'll explain later." The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The paramedics asked the standard questions. Did Craig eat something different from the others? Did he have any known allergies? Had he been drinking? Everyone said the same things. I said nothing unusual. They took Craig to Riverside Methodist. He spent 2 days in the ICU. The toxicology report identified a sedative compound, not lethal in the dose administered, but dangerous combined with alcohol, and clearly intentional. The hospital reported it. The police came to my house the following morning. I told them everything. I told them about the glass being moved. I told them what I'd done and why. I showed them where the glasses had been placed and offered to describe the exact sequence of events as precisely as I could. They interviewed Paul at his office 2 days later. He denied everything. Of course he did. But the investigation had already started, and investigations have a way of pulling threads. The financial irregularities in Paul's real estate fund had been flagged separately months before by the SEC. And the attempt on my life, because that is what it was, regardless of how measured and legal the language became afterward, gave law enforcement the foothold they needed to combine both inquiries. What came out over the following months was worse than I had imagined. Paul had been running a fraudulent investment scheme for nearly 4 years. He had raised approximately $6 million from individual investors, primarily older adults in the Columbus and Cincinnati areas. He had used my name, my reputation, the fact of our family relationship to establish legitimacy he didn't have. When his cash flow started drying up and the structure began to collapse, he had decided that the cleanest solution was to make sure I died before I could be questioned, before any investor thought to trace his references, before the whole architecture fell. Craig, his brother, had known. Not everything, he wasn't the architect of it, but he had known enough. He had handled certain transfers. He had introduced certain investors. He had agreed, when Paul asked him, to be present at my dinner table that night. The assumption, I can only guess, was that if I became ill and Craig was present, there would be less suspicion on Paul. 2 brothers at the table, 1 sick. Who would look at the other one? What Paul had not accounted for was that the man he was trying to kill had spent 3 decades learning to read a room. Renee learned the truth in stages, which I think was merciful, the way a doctor delivers a serious diagnosis, not all at once, not as a single blow, but piece by piece, giving you time to absorb each thing before the next one arrives. She had known nothing. I want to be clear about that. Because people asked me. People are still asking me, and the answer is absolute. My daughter knew nothing. She had believed in her husband the way a good person believes in the people they love, without forensic scrutiny, without a ledger kept in the back of the mind. That belief was what Paul had relied on. It was the thing about her that he had treated as a resource. She filed for divorce while he was still awaiting trial. I was with her the morning she signed the papers. She didn't cry. She sat straight in the chair across from her attorney, and she signed every page that needed signing, and when it was done, she folded her hands on the table and stared at nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, what's next?" That's my daughter. That's Helen in her, right there. Paul was convicted on federal fraud charges related to the investment scheme, and separately on charges stemming from the poisoning. His brother Craig pleaded guilty to lesser charges. Paul received 14 years. Craig received 3 years and substantial fines, the minimum I was told given his cooperation with prosecutors. I've thought a great deal about why Paul did it the way he did. Not just the attempt on my life. That part I can understand in the brutal arithmetic of a desperate man. I mean the whole 11 years. The smile. The handshakes. The bottles of wine on the doorstep, whether any of it was real, whether there were moments when he genuinely cared about Renee, about me, about any of us, or whether we were always just a balance sheet with faces. I don't have the answer to that. I'm not sure it matters anymore. What I know is this. The morning after the ambulance came for Craig, I sat in my kitchen. The same kitchen where Helen and I had taken the call about the sale of the company, where we'd sat quietly together in the years before she got sick, where I'd spent 13 months learning to live without her. And I understood something I hadn't understood the night before. I was still here. Not because of luck, not because someone intervened, but because I had been paying attention, because I had kept the habit of watching, of noticing, of trusting the small wrongness before I could explain it. Helen used to say I had too much goodwill for the world, and maybe that's true. But I also knew, on some level I can't fully articulate, that the glass had been moved. I sold the house in Columbus last year. Too large, too quiet, too many rooms that had been Helen's before they were ours. I bought a smaller place in Granville, about 30 miles east, near the Denison University campus where I've started auditing a history course on Tuesday mornings. Renee lives 20 minutes away. We have dinner every Sunday. Sometimes we sit on the back porch and don't talk much, which is still enough. With a portion of the assets recovered from Paul's fraud proceedings, a fraction of what his victims lost. But what could be recovered? I worked with Ben Calloway and a nonprofit legal organization to establish a fund for elder financial abuse victims in Ohio. It's called the Helen Ashford Advocacy Fund. It helps people navigate the legal system when family members have stolen from them, manipulated them, used their names and their trust as instruments. The kind of thing that happens more often than anyone wants to acknowledge. The kind of thing that happens because people assume older means weaker, slower, easier to fool. Those people have never been properly tested. I am 68 years old. I built a company from nothing. I loved a woman for 40 years. I watched her die, and I didn't stop moving. And when the man sitting to my left at my own dinner table tried to take everything I had left, I noticed a glass moved 1.5 inches from where I had set it down, and I acted on what I noticed. And I am still here to tell you about it. That smile of his, the one I'd trusted for 11 years, I think about it sometimes. The way it never quite reached his eyes once you knew what you were looking at. I should have seen it sooner. Maybe. But I saw it when it mattered. And in the end, that was enough. I keep coming back to that 1.5 inches. Not the fraud, not the courtroom, not the 14-year sentence. Just that small, quiet displacement. My bourbon glass sitting slightly closer to the center of the table than I had left it. 1.5 inches that Paul had not accounted for. 1.5 inches that, in the end, changed everything. I've thought about what kind of man attempts something like that. Not in anger, not in a moment of blind desperation, but with planning. With a sport coat picked out, a bottle of wine brought to the door, a smile maintained across a dinner table while a sedative dissolved in his father-in-law's glass. That takes a particular kind of moral emptiness, not the dramatic evil you see in movies, but something quieter and more corrosive. The kind that grows in a person who has spent years deciding that other people are resources to be managed rather than lives to be respected. Paul didn't become that man the night of April 14th. He'd been becoming him for a long time. The dinner was just where it finally surfaced. And I think about Renee, about what it cost her to sit across from her attorney and sign those papers without crying. People sometimes ask me if she's okay, and I tell them the truth. She's more than okay. She's clear. There's a difference. Okay is getting through the day. Clear is knowing exactly who you are and what you're willing to carry. She lost 6 years and a marriage built on a lie. And she came out of it with her spine intact. That didn't happen by accident. That's the result of the person who, when the hardest thing came, chose to face it rather than explain it away. I'm not a man who believes the universe keeps score in any tidy or guaranteed way. I've seen good people suffer losses they didn't deserve, and bad people skate for years without consequence. But I do believe this. The choices you make quietly, when no one is watching, accumulate. They become the person you are when the real test arrives. Paul made choices for years. Small dishonesties, convenient manipulations, a gradual willingness to treat the people around him as instruments. Those choices didn't just lead to the fraud. They led to the dinner table. They led to the glass. And my choices accumulated too. 34 years of paying attention, 34 years of learning to read a room, to notice what doesn't add up, to trust a quiet signal before I could explain it in words. I didn't survive that night because I was lucky. I survived because I had spent decades building the habit of clear-eyed observation, and because when the moment came, I didn't talk myself out of what I was seeing just because the alternative was uncomfortable to consider. That's the thing I want people to take from this, if they take anything. Not the drama of it, not the satisfaction of watching a guilty man face consequences, though I won't pretend that satisfaction isn't real. What I want people to hold on to is simpler. The quality of your attention is a form of protection. Staying sharp, staying honest with yourself about what you're seeing, refusing to let comfort or loyalty blind you to what's actually in front of you. That is not paranoia. That is the most practical form of self-respect there is. Helen used to say I had too much goodwill for the world. She was right. But goodwill and clear eyes are not opposites. You can love people deeply and still see them accurately. You can extend trust and still notice when something is off. The two things can live together. They have to, really, because the world will occasionally put a Paul Strickland at your dinner table, and when it does, the only thing standing between you and that glass is whether you've been paying attention. I'm 68 years old, and I'm still paying attention. That's enough.